Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression, by Robin D.G. Kelley. Narrated by David Sadzin. Preface to the 25th Anniversary Edition, The Strange Career of Hammer and Hoe. How is this for timing? The post-Cold War and the publication of Hammer and Hoe are both 25 years old. Or to put it another way, I published an entire book about the trials, tribulations, and virtues of a communist movement in the U.S. South, just as communism, in its Soviet variety at least, took its last breath. The demise of the USSR should have no bearing on the historical value of communism, but in the early 1990s, few conservative or liberal critics saw any reason to revisit communist movements besides performing an autopsy. Given how obsessed with the present our culture is, once communists ceased to be our greatest existential threat, they became, at best, relics of the past, and at worst, the 20th century's biggest losers. Yet I'd be lying if I said Hammer and Hoe was conceived as a purely academic contribution, unburdened by presentist concerns. The book's genesis cannot be understood absent an understanding of the political and personal context in which it was written. I felt a fierce urgency to study black working-class radicalism, not because the old Soviet states were crumbling in the face of revolt, but because the apartheid state of South Africa was succumbing to a massive multiracial movement, a movement in which left trade unions and the South African Communist Party played leading roles. Far more than the fall of the Berlin Wall, Nelson Mandela's release from prison and Namibian independence, both in 1990, best represented the politics behind this book. Even the title was inspired by events in Africa. In 1970, the People's Republic of the Congo, a self-declared Marxist-Leninist socialist state, adopted the symbol of a crossed hammer and hoe for its flag. Coincidentally, the regime and its flag were replaced in 1992, another Cold War casualty. I had entered UCLA's graduate program in 1983 as an Africanist. Modern South Africa was my chosen field, and the ways in which black workers struggled under regimes of racial capitalism, how they resisted exploitation, what they fought for, how they came to define political liberation, was my primary obsession. For my doctorate, I planned to write a social history of black radical politics in South Africa that would be attentive to the culture and ideas of ordinary people. There was little indication that the 1980s would be the last decade of the Cold War. This was the era of Reaganism and Thatcherism, new imperialist wars, and new revolutions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, of capital flight, the erosion of the welfare state, neoliberal privatization schemes, and weakening of anti-discrimination laws and policies, of a wave of police and vigilante killings that struck our communities with the force of a cluster bomb. The decade, in fact, opened with police killings and non-lethal acts of police brutality emerging as a central political issue, resulting in a massive urban insurrection in Liberty City, Florida, in May 1980. The 1980s also witnessed genuine efforts by radicals to build multiracial solidarity in the unlikely realm of electoral politics. The election of Mayor Harold Washington in Chicago in 1983, along with Jesse Jackson's 1984 presidential bid, held the radical promise of rainbow coalition politics. At the same time, like many of my fellow students in the early to mid-1980s, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. By the time I set foot on UCLA's campus in the fall of 1983, the boycott and divestment movement against South Africa was in full swing. I was active in a sectarian party pursuing dreams of socialist revolution, elected president of UCLA's African Activists Association, and chaired the ad hoc committee to keep South Africa out of the Olympics, which were held in Los Angeles in the summer of 1984. We were part of a broad coalition of students calling on the University of California to divest its holdings from South Africa. We built makeshift shanty towns on campus, sat in at the South African consulate, educated our community, built momentum, and by the summer of 1986 persuaded the UC Regents to divest their $3.1 billion worth of holdings from South Africa and Namibia. While we won that battle, none of my comrades believed divestment alone would topple apartheid and birth a new democratic state founded on the principles of the Freedom Charter. We knew that the struggle inside of South Africa mattered most, and given the experiences of Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Namibia, we knew it would be bloody. The United Democratic Front, the African National Congress, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, or COSATU, demonstrated the power of massive popular resistance, strikes, civil disobedience, the power of people to stop South Africa's racial regime from functioning. Though it may seem hard to believe now, these were revolutionary times, politically and theoretically. In the fog of negotiating movement work and schoolwork, I embraced a group of radical thinkers who believed another world was possible. C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral, Manning Marable, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Angela Davis, Chinwezu, Vincent Harding, Cornel West, Barbara Smith, Stuart Hall, Edward Said, and Samir Amin, among others, wrote about the ravages of racial capitalism, the violence of patriarchy, the futility of parochial politics in the face of global imperialism, and the absolute necessity to resist. But resistance to what end? I began to think about the persistent failure of socialist and communist movements to mobilize black people. And then I encountered Cedric Robinson's extraordinary book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, 1983, which exposed a fundamental fallacy in the way I framed the problem. It was never about a failing in the left's ability to mobilize black people, but our conceptual failure to recognize a black radical tradition critical of and illegible to a Euro-American left formed by the logic of Western civilization. When this tradition found its way into left movements, in Africa, Latin America, even the United States, it brought its own unique vision, historical sensibility, and set of resistance strategies to the communist movement. In doing so, it altered the party. In other words, whereas most scholars set out to prove just how alien communism was to black people, Robinson compelled me to ask what black people, in this case black South Africans, brought to the left to make it their own. The presumed objects of communist machinations became subjects and agents in making their own history. Taking my cue from Cedric Robinson, I published an essay in our graduate student-run journal, Ufahamu, on the Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA, arguing that a black radical tradition, rooted in earlier notions of African redemption, rural opposition to land dispossession, and expressions of working-class and petite bourgeois African nationalism, had produced a demand for self-determination before the Communist International was formed. Unable to recognize African radicalism, white South African communists initially oriented their work toward the white working class. Imagine a communist party anywhere backing striking miners under the banner, "Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa." When African trade unionists, as well as officials of the Communist International, Comintern, in Moscow, criticized party leaders for their uncritical support of the all-white Rand Revolt in 1922, to the exclusion of the more numerous African miners' struggles, white South African communists made the absurd argument that the advanced white proletariat must win the fight for socialism first in order to free the entire working class. Predictably, the Comintern directed the CPSA to redirect its work toward the African masses. African and colored communists, who now constituted the party's majority, understood the directive to mean waging a mass struggle for African self-determination, sovereignty, massive land reform, and majority rule. White communists, on the other hand, interpreted the Comintern's resolution as a mandate to educate the backwards African working class to support a white-led proletarian revolution. The idea of a white-led proletarian revolution in South Africa was doomed from the start, as the 1922 Rand Revolt demonstrated, and the African, colored, and Indian comrades knew it. But since whites still held the reins of the CPSA, non-white communists depended on the Comintern to lay down the law, as it were. Although I had concluded that the Comintern played a key role in enforcing the demand for African self-determination, the essay's central contribution, I think, was to turn the usual claim that the communists had infiltrated the African nationalist movement on its head. Rather, the nationalists infiltrated the Communist Party, adopted a radical vision of self-determination that recognized South Africa as a settler colonial state, and demanded the return of land and black majority rule, expressed as an independent native South African republic with full equal rights for all races. This article, despite its overly rigid formulations and archival limitations, planted the seeds for Hammer and Hoe. I extended my proposed thesis to include the U.S. South, hoping to produce a comparative study of black radicalism and the communist left in two global industrial cities, Johannesburg and Birmingham, Alabama. Without going into the messy details, let me just say that the project was always untenable, since I had no prospect of getting into South Africa and therefore no access to the necessary archives. In 1985, the year my dissertation prospectus was approved, President P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency, making travel to South Africa all but impossible. And my participation in protests at the South African consulate in Beverly Hills did not bode well for my visa application. I ended up dropping the South African component, switching to U.S. history, and focusing my research entirely on Alabama. The rest, as they say, is history. Nothing, neither Nell Irvin Painter's magnificent The Narrative of Hosea Hudson, His Life as a Negro Communist in the South, 1979, nor black Marxism fully prepared me for what I encountered in Alabama. The testimonies and memories, the archives, the very landscape constituted living proof that a political culture distinct from the Euro-American left and rooted in older Afro-Christian and black folk traditions dominated the Communist Party in Alabama. The overwhelming, startling evidence compelled me to leave a lot of my assumptions about Marxist-Leninist movement culture behind. Relying on police records, the local and national communist press, leaflets and handbills, oral histories, photographs, even a marked-up Bible, I found some dramatic episodes of armed sharecroppers fighting cops and landlords, interracial demonstrations in downtown Birmingham, and legal cases that transformed local injustices into international scandals. But I also found lots of small stories of how black communists made themselves and their movement visible when their lives depended on invisibility, by leaving their mark on wet concrete, by placing leaflets in trees, releasing them on the ground for the wind to distribute, hiding them in the laundry baskets of domestic workers going into their white comrades' homes, by sending unsigned penny postcards to social workers and city relief agencies to demand more assistance and better treatment, by restoring a neighbor's electricity using jumper cables when he or she could not pay the bill, by playing the role of Sambo before a judge in order to escape a jail sentence. I wasn't prepared for characters such as Lemon Johnson, a former member of the communist-led Sharecroppers Union. In December 1986, I visited Johnson at his home in rural Montgomery County, which I described in my journal as a tiny, run-down shack with battered wooden walls, a rusted tin roof that had begun to cave in, and a porch stocked with 3 rickety chairs. He fed me a huge lunch of collard greens, beans, Wonder Bread, fried chicken, and a slice of cake. We ate outside and talked for a while. When it became unbearably cold, we moved inside. I sat on his bed as he slouched in a wooden chair next to me. A faded picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was tacked to the wall above his head. He told stories about the 1935 cotton pickers' strike, Stalin's pledge to send troops to Mobile to help black sharecroppers if things got out of hand, and the night a well-armed group of women set out to avenge their comrades who had been beaten or killed during the strike. When I asked Mr. Johnson how the union succeeded in winning some of their demands, without the slightest hesitation he reached into the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a dog-eared copy of V.I. Lenin's What Is to Be Done and a box of shotgun shells, set both firmly on the bed next to me, and said, "Right there, theory and practice. That's how he did it. Theory and practice." I spent nearly a year in the field, scouring archives all over the country, trying to piece together the history of a semi-underground movement that deliberately left few traces. Alabama communists succeeded so well, in fact, that several Southern historians did not believe there was enough evidence to warrant a dissertation, let alone a book. My dissertation ultimately weighed in at 698 pages. Besides, it seemed that parts of the story had been told elsewhere. Ned Cobb eloquently recounts the story of the Sharecroppers Union in Theodore Rosengarten's 1974 oral narrative, All God's Dangers, The Life of Nate Shaw. And Nell Irvin Painter's The Narrative of Hosea Hudson captures the radical democratic vision of a grassroots black communist leader in Birmingham. Painter and Rosengarten were able to draw out the psychic, social, and political costs of being a black radical in the Deep South. I had imagined the archetypal black communist as heroic and intellectually astute, delivering fiery street corner speeches and fighting cops as they drag evicted workers' furniture back into their homes. But this wasn't Hudson. Not exactly. After I read Painter's book and interviewed him, Hudson reminded me of my grandfather from South Carolina, from his colloquial speech, his superstitions, and love of good gospel music, to his constant refrain that he was probably right, since so-and-so was dead and he was still living. This blew my mind and made me rethink what it meant not just to be a communist, but a movement person who was poor, black, and intelligent, despite a lack of formal education. It profoundly shaped my view of the communist and working-class political culture in the South. His story was the greatest reminder that people are constantly in motion. They always have the potential for transformation, and participation in social movements is the prime catalyst. We see Hudson change before our very eyes, from a quiet, unassuming child of a sharecropper without much to look forward to a confident leader, powerful speaker, and Marxist-Leninist to boot. I'm indebted to Nell Painter, not only for her magnificent portrait of Hudson, but for the care she took to read and critique early drafts of Hammer and Hoe. She, along with Mark D. Nason, author of Communists in Harlem During the Depression, and Theodore and Dale Rosengarten, read the entire manuscript and offered invaluable advice and suggestions. Dale's 1969 Radcliffe College thesis on the history of the Alabama Sharecroppers Union paved the way for all subsequent research on the movement. Another scholar who followed in her footsteps and generously shared with me his findings and contacts was the Venerable Shinobu Isuki, a Japanese historian who spent over a decade documenting the history of agrarian radicalism in the Black Belt. Two scholars in particular helped me make sense of the Alabama Communist Party's distinctive political culture. First, by sheer coincidence, the late George Raywick became a mentor to me in the spring of 1987. He had accepted a visiting position at UCLA just as I returned from the field and began writing my dissertation. Illness rendered him virtually immobile, so I volunteered to drive him to campus. 3 days a week I would guide him to the cafe in North Campus, secure his 2 cinnamon rolls and coffee, and sit with him for an hour or more. He schooled me in ways to interpret working-class movements, culture, and resistance, and introduced me to some of his groundbreaking essays, such as The Historical Roots of Black Liberation, 1968, Notes on the American Working Class, 1968, and Working Class Self-Activity, 1969. By paying greater attention to Raywick's concept of self-activity, I found that Alabama's communists opened up another world of politics, since most of the people the party fought for did not join insurgent organizations. They fought back as individuals or groups, often using strategies intended to cover their tracks. Raywick also insisted I read Class and Culture in Cold War America, A Rainbow at Midnight, by an incredible young historian named George Lipsitz. First published in 1981, the book offered a provocative and convincing thesis that the post-war period was not the death of labor's struggle, but one of the most active, militant periods of working-class opposition in U.S. history. Most importantly, he discovered in popular culture expressions of working-class desire and developed a whole new way to analyze the cultures of aggrieved populations. I was hooked. Just a year later, in 1988, he published A Life in the Struggle, Ivory Perry and the Culture of Opposition, a brilliant biography of St. Louis organizer Ivory Perry that literally forced me to rewrite large sections of what by then had become Hammer and Hoe, the book manuscript. Lipsitz's argument that Ivory Perry was formed by and operated within a culture of opposition gave me the framework I needed to understand the local political culture and to help me see the Alabama communists and their supporters as organic intellectuals. Once I did that, I could see the cultural and ideological bases of their own way of seeing alternatives to the status quo. I came to understand why the Bible was more important in challenging the dominant ideology than, say, Marx or Lenin. Thanks to the many readers acknowledged in the text, and my indefatigable team at UNC Press, notably Iris Tillman Hill, then editor-in-chief and the project's first champion, and my tireless and patient editor Louis Bateman, I forged these stories into a work of which I'm still quite proud. Garnering critical praise from historians and across disciplines, Hammer and Hoe won a couple of noteworthy book prizes, was the subject of round-table discussions, and has been widely taught and cited. A passage from the book even turned up on the law school admission test. After 25 years, it is still in print. And while I've appreciated the professional recognition, I have been especially moved by the responses I've gotten from activists who read the book on their own or in study groups. Organizers from the Labor Community Strategy Center, Los Angeles, Project South, Atlanta, Standing Together to Organize a Revolutionary Movement, Storm, Bay Area, and the Miami Workers Center, to name a few, have all conveyed to me the valuable political lessons they took from the book. For example, young activists who often felt that divisions of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality were insurmountable, or assumed that identities determined political choices and alliances, learned that solidarity is a dynamic, often unpredictable process, shaped inexorably by actual struggles in real time. Black working-class Alabamians did not join the Communist Party out of some economic calculation or because they were driven by narrow interest group politics. They were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting for each other and for a fairer, less oppressive world for all. But the most illuminating lessons I took from the book came not from political activists, but from a playwright. A little over 10 years ago, Hammer and Hoe inspired critically acclaimed author Naomi Wallace to write Things of Dry Hours, a powerful three-person play set in 1930s Birmingham. Tice Hogan, an older, widowed, black communist leader, lives with his daughter Kelley, a domestic worker, and they suddenly find themselves having to give refuge to a young white comrade wanted by the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company's, TCI, private police. Wallace had completely absorbed every nuance, every argument, every detail in the book, and grasped what it meant to build a radical, interracial, working-class movement in the heart of the Deep South. She understood that violence and even death came with the territory, and yet she deliberately avoided the kinds of violent confrontations and public events I always thought were most dramatic. Instead, she brilliantly set the entire play inside Tice Hogan's tiny shotgun house, transforming it into a secret refuge hidden in plain sight. We don't see the violence or the protests or the actual street organizing, but we know it's there. The virtually claustrophobic setting becomes a metaphor for the interior lives of Southern working people, black and white, radical and reactionary. Wallace succeeded in taking three characters and reconstructing the world I found so elusive. The complex story of how people struggle to find life, love, meaning, and connection under the incredible circumstances of building a revolutionary movement in the Jim Crow South. Things of Dry Hours does not dramatize the facts, but lays bare emotional truths, reveals what bubbles underneath the surface. In this case, love and desire. She revealed father-daughter love in the context of building a new society in their heads. Comradely love across the color line. Sexual agency and terror. As we now know, all predictions that the end of the Cold War spelled the death of communist history proved premature. On the contrary, research and writing on the Communist Party USA, CPUSA, have proliferated since the publication of Hammer and Hoe. One reason for the growing interest has been the opening of the Russian State Archive of Social and Political History, RGASPI, a consequence of the end of the Cold War. The availability of the Soviet archives has opened up new windows onto both local and international histories of communist parties, especially from the mid to late 1920s to the mid-1930s. For example, Glenda Gilmore's superb book, Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1919 to 1950, judiciously plumbs the Soviet archives to reveal how conversations in Moscow, New York, and South Africa influenced communist strategy in the South during the 1930s. Randy Storch's Red Chicago, American Communism at its Grassroots, 1928 to 1935, creatively draws on the Soviet archives to paint a rich picture of daily work and political life among the cadre in the Windy City. For this new edition of Hammer and Hoe, I considered incorporating the Soviet archival material, but what I found would not have changed my argument. The new material would have allowed me to flesh out certain stories, say a bit more about debates in the Soviet Union over the interpretation of self-determination, and quote some of the fascinating letters from District 17 leaders such as Ted Wellman or Nat Ross. This would have made the book bigger while leaving the essential narrative unchanged. I did make a few minor corrections where appropriate.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?